I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Astral Affairs Rambova, and I want to read my book to you. Cousin Cassio. As I neared completion of this book, I received a surprising article from an archivist in London. The article appeared in the Exhibitor's Herald and Moving Picture World on August 25, 1928, and included an advertisement for a movie titled Who Am I?, starring Natacharambova and an actor, Cassio. I knew there was no mention of this film in Natasha's filmography, and could scarcely believe what I was reading. Yet there it was, an image of Natacharambova seated left, facing forward, and to her left stood an actor in mid-conversation, with the caption reading, quote, "Right, star and feminine lead in a feature-length comedy made by the Prince Film Producing Company. Cassio, Italian comedian, heads the cast of Who Am I?, and which he is supported by Natacharambova, widow of Valentino, who is shown with Cassio here. The picture is the first of a series, being directed by John L. McCutcheon," end quote. An immediate search of Rambova and Cassio in newspaper archives revealed a few more mentions, in which Cassio was billed as the European Charlie Chaplin, comedy star of international fame, and a cousin of Rudolphvalentino. It was alleged he was sponsored in America by an ex-official of the Italian government, Joseph Cassisi. In one article, Cassio was referred to as an Italian cavaliere, a prestigious honor bestowed on notable Italians by the King of Italy, then King Vittorio Emanuele III. These articles, advertising the movie Who Am I?, shared more thrilling news. Natacharambova was scheduled to appear in a second film, a talkie titled That's Nothing, with Cassio and his Prince Film Producing Company, of 1480 Broadway at 42nd Street, New York City. I had to wonder, did Natacharambova make a talking film? Was there actually a recording of her voice? My first reaction to news of this film was to consider its timing rather mystifying. At the time of its release, in the summer of 1928, Natacharambova was involved in serious endeavors and had gone down her many other paths. That summer, she granted several interviews to announce her dress shop was such a success she was expanding into the wholesale market. She was also involved with both the Theosophical Society and the Rurich Society, and enjoying the early days of her love affair with Svatoslav Rurich. She had not appeared in a movie in 3 years, and her few stage appearances since that time were nothing to write home about, so I wondered how she came to appear in Cassio's Who Am I?, and who was Cassio? I set out to learn all I possibly could about Cassio, and began by contacting the Cineteca di Bologna in Italy, a prestigious European film library. They responded to my request for information by saying they had nothing in their archives regarding Cassio's career in Italy or in Europe. They did, however, find references to his American films. The most significant data learned from the Cineteca di Bologna was that Cassio's birth name was Domenico Nicasio. An online search of ship manifests revealed Domenico Nicasio's arrival in New York aboard the vessel Giuseppe Verdi, arriving on September 8, 1922 from Naples. He was then 25 years old and his occupation listed as artist. His birthplace was recorded as Caneto di Bari, his father as Gennaro Nicasio, and mother as Vita Gaetana Cesara Guglielmi. At this point in my Cassio research, the London archivist forwarded a link to the 6th Annual Silent Film Identification Workshop investigating mostly lost films, sponsored by the Library of Congress in June of 2017 and held in Culpeper, Virginia at the Packard Campus for Audio-Visual Conservation. One of the film historians participating in the event was Dr. Robert J. Kiss, who delivered a lecture titled Silent Film's Most Forgotten Star, The Lost Italian-American Laughter of Cassio. I contacted Dr. Kiss, and he graciously shared his Cassio research with me, including the images he used in his lecture and a transcript of his speech. Cassio's identity and the history of Natacharambov's last and lost movie began to take shape. Dr. Kiss's lecture focused on the silent genre he refers to as, quote, the fly-by-night world of Poverty Row silent comedy films shot in and around New York City during the 1920s, end quote. His particular attention was paid to, quote, East Coast Italian-American Poverty Row comedies produced between 1923 and 1929, end quote. According to Dr. Kiss, Domenico Nicasio changed his name to Cassio after getting the idea from the Cassio Film Company, which was owned and operated in New York City by his cousin Trifone Nicasio and Trifone's father, Vittore. Cassio began his career in America as a member of a vaudeville act performing as the De Rosas, and it was there he met his wife Valentina in 1925. He soon collaborated with his cousin Trifone and uncle Vittore to learn the business of comedy filmmaking. In this endeavor, he would establish his own business, the Bohème Film Company, and partner with Caterina Avella. Caterina Avella not only acted in Cassio's films, she also wrote his screenplays. The short comedic films produced by Cassio's Bohème Film Company and written by Avella address themes of interest to the Italian immigrant population, such as proficiency in English and Americanization in general. By the beginning of 1928, Cassio changed the name of his company to the Prince Film Producing Company. He announced he was again collaborating with actress and screenplay writer Caterina Avella on his first full-feature movie titled Who Am I?, which was scheduled to be filmed at the Pathé Manhattan Studios. The bigger news was that Who Am I would feature an appearance by none other than Natacharambova. In Cassio's promotional material for this film, he made a few additions to his public profile. In advance of his screen appearance with Natacharambova, Cassio advertised himself as Domenico Cassio Guglielmi and alleged he was Rudolph Guglielmi Valentino's cousin. His personal promos included the titles of Cav, C-A-V, as an abbreviation of Cavaliere, and Ubarese, which is the Italian region of Puglia's slang expression meaning the man from Bari. In his lecture, Dr. Kiss points out that although Cassio's mother's surname was Guglielmi, as was Valentino's, and although Cassio came from a city only 30 miles from Valentino's birthplace of Castellaneta, he was unable to find any connection between the two men. At this point in my research, I contacted noted Valentino historian and researcher Professor Aurelio Micoli, a native of Castellaneta in the region of Puglia and Valentino's birthplace. While researching his book on Rudolph Valentino's childhood, The Infancy of the Myth, he became familiarized with local archives, genealogical resources, and was locally renowned as a scholar studying the history of Rudolph Valentino's family. Professor Micoli agreed to investigate any connection between Cassio and Rudolph Valentino. Was there a family connection which might explain why Natacharambova would agree to appear in Cassio's film? Did Rudolph Valentino have a cousin producing Italian-American comedy films in New York in the 1920s? Professor Micoli first located Cassio's birth certificate and his parents' marriage certificate in the archives of the city of Adelphia, a city created in 1927 through the unification of two small cities, Canneto and Montrone. Cassio's registry entries revealed he was born in Canneto on November 28, 1897, with his mother being Vita Gaetana Cesara Guglielmi, his father Gennaro Nicasio, and his brother christened Vincenzo. Professor Micoli was remarkably successful in his search for existing family members in the region. Through his connections with local historians, an interview was arranged between Professor Micoli and Cassio's great-nephew, a lawyer and amateur actor, Avvocato Giovanni Monteleone of Adelphia. Giovanni Monteleone shared his family's history in regards to his relative Domenico Nicasio, Cassio with Professor Miccoli. As Cassio's great-nephew, his maternal grandfather was Cassio's brother Vincenzo. His great-grandmother was Vita Gaetana Cesara Guglielmi, a relative of Valentino's father, Giovanni Guglielmi. During the interview, Mr. Monteleone recalled how his mother attributed their artistic interests as a family to their famous relative Rudolph Valentino. Quote, "We are all artists like Valentino," she often said to her son, Giovanni. During Professor Miccoli's interview with Mr. Monteleone, he was invited to photograph a collection of framed images of Cassio's American film career, which were prominently displayed in the Monteleone home. Many family stories were shared about their artistic and colorful relative Cassio, including his chronological history and the mention of his sensibility for beautiful women. Through his connection with Giovanni Monteleone, Professor Miccoli confirmed a family connection between Cassio and Rudolph Valentino. Yet this presented further questions for me. Did Rudolph Valentino know Domenico Nicasio in Italy? Had they met in New York when Cassio was performing in his vaudeville act, the De Rosas? When did Natacharambova first meet Cassio? From the timelines of both Rudolph Valentino and Cassio's lives, it can be surmised that they could have met in New York after 1923, as they were both living in the city at the time. It is not known whether they were in contact in Italy before Valentino left for America in 1913. With only a 2-year age difference between the two young Guglielmis, it is possible that as teenagers they spent time together. With a connection between the two men presented, I was intrigued to know more about Rambova's last movie. In Dr. Kiss's speech, he surmises the plot of Who Am I, as the script has not been located to date. He constructed the basic plotline from the scant press coverage for the film and the few surviving images. The storyline appears to have been centered around Cassio's character having amnesia and his confusion over whether his wife was a plain woman played by Camille Renaud or Natacharambova, the woman who always wore the pearls. Perhaps Cassio was inspired to use the subject of amnesia in the film's script by reading the headlines in Italian-American newspapers at the time. In Italy in 1927, the high-profile case of Bruneri and Cannella was then holding audiences rapt. Emotions about the case ran high, with Italian-American populations sharply divided over the gripping drama. The case involved the story of a man named Cannella, a World War I amnesia victim who wandered lost in northern Italy, and an imposter, Bruneri, who came forward to assume Cannella's identity. The imposter Bruneri resembled Cannella and would so successfully convince Cannella's wife he was her lost husband, she would bear 3 children with him. Despite a court ruling Bruneri to be a total fraud, Cannella's wife was not convinced and left for Brazil with a man she believed to be her husband, the bandit Bruneri. Did the story on all the front pages of Italian-American newspapers at the time inspire Cassio's film, Who Am I? On August 2nd, 1928, Cassio began distributing his first-length movie, Who Am I?, by having it shown in East Coast Italian-American theaters. He appeared confident in having Natacharambova star in the film and made an announcement on August 22nd, 1928, revealing his new invention, which he called Movie Sound. Quote, "A new talking device will be used by the Prince Film Producing Company for a series of features starring Cassio, Italian-American comedian and cousin of Rudolph Valentino. It is known as Movie Sound and is a brand new patent different from those now on the market. Cassio has completed his first independent picture, Who Am I?, and will make That's Nothing, a talking picture, as his second feature-length comedy." End quote. However, Cassio struggled to secure a broad audience for Who Am I? With box office returns meager, Cassio lost money on its release, and his Prince Films Producing Company soon went bankrupt. There was no funding for his Movie Sound device, or to invest in his next film, That's Nothing, a talkie slated to star Natacharambova. By August of 1929, Cassio was unable to pay the rent at Lloyd's film storage facility, and all 20 reels of his footage were sold at auction. Who Am I appears to have then disappeared. Prince Film Producing Company and Cassio's career as a film producer folded. Cassio returned to the vaudeville circuit, but would surface 1 year later in Dayton, Ohio. According to local Dayton newspapers in September of 1930, Cavaliere Cassio announced he would be opening the European Studios in Dayton on October 15th. His studio would offer a broad curriculum, including dramatic courses taught for opera, drama, talkies, stage, and screen. Cassio's press release promoted himself as Rudolphvalentino's cousin, and states he spent the previous 2 years as the director of the Paramount Conservatory of Art in New York. Cassio's School of Operatic Instruction announced one of his Italian artist teachers as Carla Castellani. Carla Castellani was a well-known soprano, then singing in La Scala in Milan, and would not visit the United States until the fall of 1946, when she made her American debut touring the country, singing in Tosca. It appears Cassio's European Studios never realized. According to his great-nephew, Giovanni Mattaleone, at that time Cassio returned to his hometown in southern Italy with his wife and young son Gennaro. It was then he organized many dramatic productions and stage shows in the region of Puglia, which were well received. In 1935, a ship's manifest lists Cassio, Domenico Nicasio, and his wife Valentina and son Gennaro as passengers arriving in New York City. In September of 1939, Cassio and his wife would divorce, and he moved to Providence, Rhode Island, to find work as an actor. Dr. Kiss reports that after a stage performance in Providence, Rhode Island on April 19, 1940, Cassio collapsed and died of a heart attack at 42 years old. Perhaps a mystery exists in this account, as a United States Census worker recorded a Domenico Nicasio actor as a lodger at 84 Broadway in Providence on April 24, 1940. The answer to my question of why Natacharambova appeared in Cassio's one full-length movie was found in a small mention in the French publication Cine Commedia. It was there reported she made the film because she and Rudolphvalentino promised Cassio they would help him. The article was titled A Family Affair and read in its entirety as translated. Quote, Cassio, cousin of Rudolphvalentino, has remained on excellent terms with Natacharambova. The wife of the celebrated artist had promised Cassio that she would not lose sight of him, and even on one occasion offered to help him. This was not a promise in the air, since we learned that Cassio will make 2 films, including one scheduled to be a talkie. Cassio on the screen will remain Cassio. This is a wise decision and even heroic, because it is certain that Valentino's name has tempted him quite often. But this is due to the fact that Valentino's brother Alberto comes to Hollywood to make a sensational debut in the film titled Tropic Madness. Alberto himself will be called Valentino, whose real name, like his brother, was Guglielmi. Let us wish him to have, as we say, backbone, because although it's a wonderful inheritance, it appears a heavy name to bear. End quote. Dr. Kiss poses the question, if Cassio was a Guglielmi relative, why did he not make mention of this earlier, when Valentino died in 1926? This could be explained as Cassio had no audience to explain this to at the time. Yet this presents another question. Was Valentino's brother Alberto Guglielmi, who was then in Hollywood pursuing his own movie career, in contact with Cassio? In the late 1920s, Alberto Guglielmi was in the throes of aggressively policing his deceased brother Rudolph's legacy, and certainly would have protested the use of his brother's name if the connection was false. Perhaps Alberto Guglielmi hoped his relative's Prince Film Producing Company would offer him screen roles. For after 2 years attempting to replace his brother Rudolph on screen, Alberto Guglielmi appeared in but one movie, Tropic Madness, which opened in December of 1928. Was there an affiliation between Cassio and Alberto Guglielmi? Perhaps so, for coincidentally, while Cassio was promoting Who Am I, an Alberto production company was also producing Italian-American short films. Could Cassio's lost reels of footage of Who Am I, sold at auction in 1929, still exist in some archive? Will Natasha Rambova's last screen appearance be found? A movie she made as a generous gesture to a cousin of her lost love, Rudolph. The photograph of the cast of Who Am I, which Giovanni Monteleone so generously shared for inclusion in this book, reveals a cordial gathering of actors, cameraman, and director. Natasha Rambova sits demurely, bestowing a supportive glance at Cassio, the man who cast her in this final screen role as the woman who always wears pearls. Her appearance in this lost film stands as a touching footnote to her love for Rudolph and a definitive statement as to the familial connection between Rudolphvalentino and Cassio Cavaliere Ubarese.